Director General Sri Jayant Prasad, IDSA fraternity, scholars and distinguished guests. I may also add Honorable Minister, Honorable Raksha Mantri Sri Monroe Doctrine. Even though he is not here physically, I am sure he is here with us in spirit. Let me first thank IDSA and the Director General for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I'm not the first economist to be invited to deliver this lecture, but I'm sure the group of economists who have been invited to deliver this lecture is really very, very small. So the honor is all the more. I also want to thank IDSA for providing this opportunity. Security is not a subject I know very much about, so when I was asked to deliver this lecture, I had some hesitation. And then I asked Mr. Jayant Prasad to give me a possible set of subjects on which I should speak. He gave me 3 such subjects, each of which was centered on security. And so it posed a difficult problem. Luckily, one of those 3 subjects was security and development. And I thought, well, I do know something about development. And perhaps I could find some time somewhere to learn a little bit about security as well. And then the connection can be made. Nevertheless, I have been sort of trying to study fast, learn fast, something about security, but I am sure what I have to say will fall far short of what your expectations might be. And indeed, I try to follow the rule that generally if you are speaking to an audience, make sure that you know a little bit more than most of your audience. Today that rule has been broken. But we shall see. Let me just say a few things about IDSA. Actually, I was very pleased that, this is the prime think tank in the area of security almost anywhere. And truly, it is to the credit of our earlier generations to have seen the need for such an institution that early in time. And they set up really a first-rate institution which has really stood the test of time. I also remarked the fact that the institution was founded in November 1965. Now that is the year actually in which the Prime Minister was Lal Bahadur Shastri. And I have often felt that he has been one of the rather underappreciated Prime Ministers, although he is one of the prime ministers who really within a very short period, right? Part of what underappreciation comes from the fact that only those who lived that time probably remember that, and much of the younger generation doesn't know enough about it. But Lal Bahadur Shastri really in a very short period of time, of course, he was the prime minister when the first war that raised the morale of the country had been fought. I remember 1962 India-China war. We were all very depressed about that war, and 65 really got our heads a bit up. But that's not the only thing actually. A lot of the agricultural institutions that got built up in India were actually, which till today survive, were actually conceived and begun during that period. So the entire the Food Corporation of India, the Agricultural Price Commission, even the Dairy Development Corporation, these are all started during Lal Bahadur Shastri's years. And so I was very pleased to actually see that this institution was also begun during Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri's tenure, and it is to some degree no surprise. He was the Prime Minister who gave us this slogan Jai Jawan Jai Kisan, and so he really felt for both Kisan and Jawan very much. With that, let me turn to the subject of the day today. As I said, I begin with some trepidation, given the audience, the distinguished audience, and my own limited knowledge of security. At the outset, I will begin by defining what we mean by security and what we mean by development. As I began reading some of the literature, I realized that these have been defined variously, meaning that development, I have known that it has been defined variously. Although even there, I'd sort of not gone into the definition of development in the context of security, so I learned something new. But I also found that security itself actually gets defined in a variety of ways, depending on the context. And if we are going to really be able to talk meaningfully about security and development, it is important to get the definitions at least initially spelled out. Only then we can meaningfully discuss the relationship between the two. So traditionally we have defined development to refer to the process of economic growth leading to rising per capita incomes. Sometimes, it is asserted that original authors who talked about development saw it only in terms of the GDP, which is simply not true. Actually, development term has always been seen as a wider term, of which, of course, per capita income increase is a very important aspect for good reasons, which I may come to towards the end of the lecture, but certainly it is not true that any serious author of development has defined development only as per capita income increase. It often has been actually seen in the context of also reduced poverty, increased opportunities for gainful employment, and increased access to basic amenities of life such as water, electricity, and transportation. Minimally, at least, that has been the definition of development that has been used. Today, the definition certainly has been expanded further, and it is commonly defined also to include things like digital connectivity, clean environment, and of course access to education and health are also very critical part of the definition of development today. Now that, of course, as I mentioned, in the context of security, sometimes the definition of development gets further widened, and we also include security in the definition of development. That, what is development that does not guarantee me security against violence and so forth. And so sometimes development is defined to include security as a part of the definition. Security, very similarly, has narrow definitions, it has wider definitions. In its narrow form, the term is used to describe the absence of threat to the state, internal or external. So that's one kind of narrow definition that is defined in the context of security of the state, that there is no threat, existentialist or otherwise, to the state. But the term may also refer to what we may call human security, in which case it would include the absence of physical threat to an individual from organized violence. In some circles, again, the definition is extended further to refer to economic security, and then it comes to include subjects that are traditionally part of development, such as food security, health security, and employment security. Therefore, in the widest form, development and security can each be defined to include the other. So development can encompass security, and security can encompass development. It is evident, however, that such wide definition would not serve us well, since the very purpose of our discussion today is to understand the relationship between these two phenomena. So if they are one and the same, the two are one and the same, then of course one can't quite speak in terms of what the relationship between the two is. So therefore, for a meaningful discussion of the relationship, I would define the two terms such that they can be understood independently of each other. Accordingly, for the purpose of the lecture today, I will use the term security to include national and human security, but exclude economic security, which would be a part of the definition of development. Likewise, I will use the term development to refer to economic and social development, but not national or human security. I'll also exclude from the discussion today one specific form of security that is relevant today, that is cyber security, since it requires a separate treatment. For the issues that I'm going to touch on, cyber security is really not going to be central, and so I would urge you to keep that in mind as I go. So armed with these definitions, we may now proceed to study the relationship between development and security. This is a two-way relationship. Security impacts development, and development likewise impacts security. What I would do is first look at each of these two relationships, how one impacts the other, and then I'll come for a brief discussion of security and development policies. Let me first consider how security impacts development. At the outset, it must be recognized that while a minimum level of security is necessary for development, it is by no means sufficient. So the first point to remember is that security is a necessary condition for development. It's not a sufficient condition. A country may be fully secure, and yet it may not develop. And reasons are simple, that development is much more than just security, because you got to have many other policies in place. And likewise, two countries that may enjoy in some sense equal level of security doesn't mean that they would also have equal level of development. Again, the level of development is going to depend on other sets of policies that they have in place. As some context to this proposition, let me say that it is sometimes argued that the reason India performed poorly during the first 3 decades of its independence is that it had 4 successive wars in 1948, 62, 65, and 1971. So as background, I'm sure all of you know that the first, starting from 1947 practically till 1980, India grew quite slowly. This is the period which, sometimes has been referred to as the Hindu rate of growth by my own teacher, actually, Professor Raj Krishna, who first popularized that term. We grew over this period about, between somewhere 3.5 to 4% per year, and recognizing that the population itself was rising at almost 2.5%, per capita incomes changed very little on an annual basis during this period. And sometimes, at least some authors would attribute it to the fact that starting after the independence, 4 wars had to be fought, one in 1948, then 62 and 65 and 71, and it sort of then connected the poor performance, economic performance is then connected to these wars. To be sure, these wars did not help growth and development, but they alone also failed to explain the economy's poor performance. After all, we also had the Kargil War in 1999, and yet the economy exhibited a stellar performance during the decade that followed that war. In fact, if you want to identify a decade of the fastest growth in India, that was from 2003-4 to 2012-13. If you take that 10-year period, actually India grew about 7.9%. The first 9 years of that, 2003-4 to 11-12, India steadily grew at 8.3%. And this was, a period that immediately followed Kargil War. So if really, one were to attribute the performance largely to the security as reflected, or lack of security as reflected in the wars that the country had to fight, surely we shouldn't have observed really the fastest growth period soon after Kargil War. So there is more to development than security, meaning security is essential, but it certainly is not sufficient for development. The command and control model that we had pursued vigorously until 1980 held back our development in a big way. So it is really policies which mattered equally or perhaps more. Gradual liberalization in the 1980s and a more decisive shift to the market-friendly economy under Prime Ministers Narasimha Rao first and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee afterwards were what changed the game for development and growth in India. Those reforms starting from 1991, particularly when they became more systematic, although some of the liberalization had started in the 1980s as well, were the key to eventual stellar performance of the Indian economy, and they are also, for sure, behind our robust growth today. So reforms and a market-friendly set of economic policies are quite central to growth and development. While security by itself is thus not enough for development, there is compelling evidence that when violence crosses a threshold, development suffers quite badly. So it is a necessary condition, and if you really have a very insecure environment in any way, you would actually see the impact then showing up on economic development. The World Development Report of 2011, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with, marshals the evidence along various dimensions, and I will draw liberally upon it in my presentation in the next few minutes. I'll begin the discussion of how lack of security impacts growth, and then consider the implications for poverty, education, and health. So two countries from sub-Saharan Africa, Burkina Faso and Burundi, provide the most dramatic illustration of the link between violence and growth. And let me show you the slide. So if you look at that slide, at that picture, this picture is plotting the per capita incomes in the two countries. The top line represents the per capita income in Burkina Faso, and the line below it, the blue one, plots the line that shows the per capita income over time of Burundi. These per capita incomes differ a little bit from the beginning, and the blue line there, as you can see, stays below the red one throughout. That's simply the starting difference in per capita income that is there. As you go forward, actually, so now the bars that are depicting the casualties due to violence, and the red ones, there is only one orange one of a color that's different from the red one, which represents the deaths due to violence in one particular year in Burkina Faso, but the rest of the lines, the red lines, red bars, represent the deaths in Burundi due to violence. And you'll see what a dramatic impact the violence ends up having on the growth process or on the per capita income of Burundi. It's simply kind of, having traveled together those two lines, suddenly they begin to diverge in a big way. And in fact, by the time you come to the end of that line, though this is the World Development Report was written in 2011, and they had data at the time perhaps till 2008, and you would see that this divergence really ends up driving down per capita income in Burkina Faso roughly to its 1970 level. So some of the growth that had been achieved, some of the increases in per capita income that had been achieved after 1970, but with the violence having started in early 1990s and the declines happening, what you would observe is that by the end of this picture, 2008, by 2008, per capita income in Burundi had dropped to the 1970 level. And the gap between these two countries was significantly larger. The per capita income in Burkina Faso had gone practically to about 2.5 times that in Burundi. Very dramatic picture. We can get a few more examples. I'll come to one closer to home. That is Sri Lanka. This Sri Lanka offers yet another interesting example. As we know, in the early 1980s, civil war began involving the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam. Uh, and there also, you would see in the next slide, I'm going to show you in a minute. It originally, in the late 1970s and the beginning of 1980s, Sri Lankan economy was actually doing quite well. Growth certainly in Sri Lanka had been higher than growth in India during those years, and per capita income actually, if you come to early 1980s, in Sri Lanka was significantly higher than in India. But then 1983, this violence begins. The civil war begins, and it's sporadic. You know, it escalates, then cools down, it escalates again. But what it did actually was to turn growth in Sri Lanka quite volatile. So here is the picture you would see. You know, the two things. One, the war, the civil war itself would intensify sometime, then go through periods of calm. It'll then explode again, etc. There's one part of it. Part of it, of course, also that it was concentrated in one part of Sri Lanka, and so what you see is that the income growth, the graph plots not per capita income, but it's the growth rate in the GDP. So growth rate in the GDP largely, except for one particular year, it remains positive, but what you see is that it becomes significantly more volatile. And when actually violence becomes more intense, the fluctuation is generally downward, that the growth rate actually declines. And when calm begins to return, growth rate begins to recover, then of course violence intensifies again, and the growth rate dips again. But then towards the end, you'll see that after the final stage of this conflict, growth rate begins, it recovers, and then you see the growth rate actually sustaining a little better in the post end of Civil War period. What is also interesting, the graph points has some points, you will see green points. These are the poverty rates in Sri Lanka at various points in time. Poverty rates require the survey, expenditure survey or income survey of the households, and so therefore you get these numbers only at some points in time. What you'd observe is that, you know, during this period of civil war, basically the poverty doesn't change in a substantial way, but once we began to get to the end of the civil war, poverty did actually end up declining quite rapidly and significantly. So here this gives an example of poverty, to which I will come back. Now, it is intuitively quite plausible that the absence of violence would also help the fight against poverty. To the extent that conflict and wars require resources to be diverted to defense at any point in time, their absence leaves more resources for fighting anti-poverty programs. In addition, when combined with growth-enabling policies, peace and security can pave the way for rising per capita income over time, thereby augmenting the total fiscal resources available to the government. We have already seen here the abatement and end of the civil war helping bring poverty down in Sri Lanka. The World Development Report from 2011 offers some further systematic evidence. It estimates that on average, poverty reduction in countries affected by major episodes of violence has been nearly a percentage point slower per year than in countries not affected by violence. It calculates that on average, a country experiencing major violence between 1981 and 2005 had a poverty rate that was 21 percentage points higher than a country that saw no violence. So these are some simulations that the World Development Report does, and there are three levels. You know, The top one is when the violence is the countries where violence is at the highest level. These are major violence countries. Then there are minor violence countries, which is the blue line, and then you got the countries with no major or minor violence, and you see that the poverty really declines significantly more when countries are not subject to violence. So again, this is the other dimension of development, that poverty reduction in itself also suffers when countries face major episodes of violence. The WDR 211 also offers persuasive evidence linking violence and slow progress in social indicators relating to education and health. And here, really, I can do no better than quote directly from the World Development Report, and I'm going to quote. It says, people in fragile and conflict-affected states are more likely to be impoverished, to miss out on schooling, and to lack access to basic health services. Children born in fragile or conflict-affected states are twice as likely to be undernourished and nearly twice as likely to lack access to improved water. Those of primary school age are 3 times as likely not to be enrolled in school, and they are nearly twice as likely to die before their 5th birthday. As the world takes stock of progress on the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, it is apparent that the gap between violence-prone countries and other developing countries is widening. No low-income, fragile state has achieved a single MDG, and few are expected to meet targets by 2015. Because most fragile and conflict-affected states have made slower progress in the last 10 years, the gap is widening. For example, over the last 2 decades, infant mortality has been falling in nearly all countries, but reduction in infant mortality in fragile and conflict-affected countries has lagged behind. And here is this is the picture on infant mortality, and you will see that the fragile states and the low-income, fragile, conflict-affected states have a much higher rate of infant mortality, and also it declines far more slowly than in the countries where you don't have violence. So of the countries with infant mortality greater than 100 per 1,000 in 1990, those not affected by conflict have reduced infant mortality by 31%, while fragile and conflict-affected states reduced it by only 19%. If these fragile and conflict-affected states had made the same rate of progress on infant mortality as other developing countries, almost 1 million more children in these countries each year would survive their first year of life. So even in terms of education, health, different dimensions of health, different dimensions of education, you see major impact of violence on developmental achievements. So clearly, very, very strong evidence connecting security, or really connecting the lack of security to the lack of development. The examples I've given so far come uniformly from the post-Second World War experience of developing countries. But the absence of serious violence has played a critical role in growth and development throughout history. An interesting historical example of it comes from the United States. In 1823, the then President James Monroe issued the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which declared formally its opposition to European colonialism in North and South America. And what the doctrine did was to warn that the United States would see any attempt by European nations to take control of any independent states in North or South America as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards itself. In return, it recognized existing European colonies in Americas and provided assurance that the United States will not meddle in the internal affairs of European countries. So Monroe Doctrine basically was that you don't interfere in here, we will not interfere there. Let's maintain the status quo. This doctrine ushered an era of peace in the continent, allowing the United States to emerge as the new global powerhouse 5 decades later. The United States' share of world manufacturing output rose from just a bare tiny 2.4% in 1830, and remember Monroe Doctrine was promulgated in 1823, so this is the figure 7 years later, 2.4% in 1830. It rose to 14.7% in 1880 and 23.6% in 1900. During the same period, the United States military personnel witnessed a modest growth, rising from 11,000 in 1830 to 26,000 in 1860 and 36,000 in 1880. So 36,000 was all the personnel, military personnel the United States had in 1880. Compare that figure to what was going on in Europe. In Europe, there were 248,000 military personnel in the United Kingdom, 544,000 in France, and 909,000 in Russia. Not having to bother about military expenditures and enjoying the security that flowed from the Monroe Doctrine, the United States could concentrate its resources on developmental projects. This is the era during which it builds up its roads. Its really growth rates, this was the fastest growth period in the history of the United States, particularly the second half of the 19th century. At the same time, assured security created an enabling environment for economic growth in the United States. So that is an account of how security matters for economic development, or really the lack of security leads to generally lack of economic development as well. And when development does take place, it really does require at least a minimum threshold level of security. I now turn to the opposite relationship, how development impacts security. At the most elementary level, development makes a nation stronger, and this helps deter potential sources of threat to security, both external and internal. A rich economy also has a large volume of resources to devote to security, which may have a further deterrence effect. Prosperity also gives a stake to all citizens in maintaining the status quo, peace, and order. Any disruption can result in large decline in economic activity and leave everyone worse off. In contrast, when poverty is widespread, a sizable proportion of the population may have nothing to lose from disruptions. These factors partially explain generally more secure environments in developed relative to developing countries. Economic interdependence that has grown with prosperity in Europe has essentially eliminated the tensions among countries that had resulted in the Second World War. So today you see really no OECD country that has any border dispute of any importance. Two countries, mortal enemies, France and Germany, which really were the two principal players in the Second World War, at the end of the day, because of the economic development that has happened, prosperity that has arisen, or certainly not necessarily only because, but certainly that's a major factor. These two countries are today, you can't imagine that they could really go on a war. Indeed, the prosperity of Germany eventually led to the prosperity of West Germany eventually led to the unification of East and West Germany, and the two Germanys today are a single nation. Economic interdependence that has grown with prosperity in Europe has essentially eliminated the tensions among countries that had resulted in the Second World War, as I already stated. They also account in part for the concentration of left-wing extremism, LWE, in poverty-stricken areas within India. I say partially because that's a little more complicated subject, but certainly these LWE activity certainly is concentrated in poverty-stricken areas in India. Paradoxically, at low levels of income, development can also lead to increased violence. So in the literature, at least, you see this, that this relationship can sometimes go the other way, that if you're starting at a very low level of income, some increase in prosperity could actually, at least temporarily, lead to rising violence. With rising incomes, the scope for extortion rises. If development is uneven, it may also create sufficient envy on the part of certain groups to resort to violence. The spread of drugs, which may accompany rising incomes, can also give rise to organized crime and violence. Evidence broadly points to development enhancing security, though there are some microeconomic studies that find the opposite as well. Every single one of the 32 countries classified as fragile and conflict affected situations by the World Bank in 2015 is a developing economy. By 2030, 46% of the global poor are predicted to be living in fragile and conflict affected situations. So here, as you can see, development impacting security adversely. In contrast, no high income country is currently engaged in a conflict, in a direct conflict with each other. There is some microeconomic evidence showing that negative income shocks increase the risk of violence. In sub-Saharan Africa, civil war is more likely to happen in years following poor rainfall. A study of 41 African countries between 81 and 99, that is 1981 and 1999, finds that a 5% decline in economic growth raises the chances of conflict by half in the following year. Similarly, countries with high youth unemployment face a higher risk of violence. Empirical evidence supports the hypothesis that youth bulges increase the risk of domestic armed conflict. The risk is even higher when economies stagnate. An important study published in American Political Science Review focuses on the causes of civil war globally and finds that poverty and slow growth favor rebel recruitment. This same study finds that each additional 1,000 US dollars of per capita income is associated with a 35% lower chance of onset of civil war in any given year. At low levels of income, one can have the phenomenon that countries choose, it can lead, the countries may choose between essential expenditures. A sort of dilemma may arise that forces countries to choose between essential expenditures and security expenditures. It is an issue I will return to towards the end. It is an issue that arises for richer countries as well, but certainly the low level of per capita income, this sort of choice can turn into a very serious, difficult choice. This is what goes by the name of the guns versus butter dilemma. For example, countries needing to spend financial resources on urgent life-saving items such as vaccines, food, and basic water and sanitation facilities are unable to adequately invest in crime prevention and succumb to violence. According to one estimate, the average cost of civil war is equivalent to more than 30 years of GDP growth for a medium-sized developing country. Close to our home, we have studies focusing on the impact of the introduction of National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, NREGA, on LWE violence. I briefly mention here the results of two studies with seemingly conflicting findings. The first study finds that the adoption of NREGA scheme between 2006 and 2008 led to 80% reduction in violent incidents and deaths related to Maoist activity. The effect is even larger in districts experiencing negative rainfall shocks. But the second study paradoxically finds that insurgency-related violence increases in the first year following the introduction of NREGA, and the effect is concentrated in the very short run. The authors suggest that this may be because anti-poverty programs such as NREGA induce citizens to share more information with the state, making police action more effective and hence causing a spike in violent incidents. That is the discussion of how development itself impacts security. I now briefly turn to the issue of complementarity versus competing aspects of development and security policies. So up to now, I have spoken about the interaction between development and security, how the absence of security impacts development, and how development impacts security. In this concluding section, I briefly turn to a discussion of policies for security and development. I focus on how policies aimed at promoting development and security may be complementary or in conflict, that is, when they are friends and when they are foes of each other. The most widely discussed context of the two policies pulling in opposite directions is, of course, that of guns versus butter question. Resources, whether human or financial, are limited. The more we deploy them in building military, the less will be left for social programs. President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to expand welfare spending to promote his Great Society program. This Great Society program, of course, refers to the successor program to the New Deal program of Roosevelt. This was a major social program that Lyndon Johnson wanted to pursue. But this wish of his was greatly undercut by military spending necessitated by the Cold War and the Vietnam War. According to a New York Times story, Johnson lamented towards the end of his life, "That bitch of a war killed the lady I really loved, the Great Society." When threats to security exist, all finance ministers must struggle with the guns versus butter question. Civil society groups regularly make demands that we cut defense spending so that social spending may be increased. Wars can impact development policy in other ways as well. In India, shortages during the Second World War had given rise to a variety of controls, including import licensing and price and distribution controls. Many of these controls continued after the end of the Second World War and indeed influenced our policy choices in the post-independence era. So, in fact, the wars can also have a policy impact for quite a while, even till after the war is actually over. More often than not, security and development go hand in hand. This happens most frequently in the area of innovation. Innovations initially meant for security purposes may become powerful agents of change in the area of economic development. The internet is a prime example. In the late 1960s, the United States Department of Defense originally funded an early version of the internet under the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, or what is called abbreviated as ARPANET. This innovation not only became a source of productivity improvement for civilians, but also saw significant advances once it came into the wider use. This was clearly an example of synergies between military and civil innovation processes. In a similar vein, advances in nuclear research were greatly hastened by military research during the Second World War. This research eventually also led to the development and wider use of nuclear power, which has acquired great importance in modern times due to the threat to the environment and climate from fossil fuels. Today, security and development policies have seen a substantial convergence. Internationally, peace missions must perform tasks that involve both civil and military tasks. They must help secure the areas, but their work no longer ends there. They must also ensure that agencies involved in development work are protected. Finally, without such protection, development would remain under the threat of violence and disruption. Finally, closer to home, I'll conclude with this example. Development and security agencies in LWE affected regions also must work together if roads are to be constructed to improve connectivity. The path of those building roads must be secured. So here we have examples from Chhattisgarh actually where the developmental agencies, the rural road and highway development, all when it has to be done in the areas that are impacted by the LW insurgency, both the Home Ministry and the Rural Development Ministry effectively have to work together with the Home Ministry providing the security cover and the Rural Development Ministry building the roads. So here again, our policies for security and development come together. I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much.